Good afternoon. Hi, thank you all for coming. I am just going to do a few announcements and then get out of the way and let my colleague, Dr. Grimm, introduce today's speaker. Thank you for coming to our talk today. Dr. Darren Grimm is going to introduce our speaker. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Afton. My name is Dr. Darren E. Grimm. I'm an associate professor of history and Southern studies here at the University of Mississippi. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Susan Gaunt-Stearns. She is also an associate professor of history at the University of Mississippi. She's originally from New York City, and she earned her bachelor's degree from Yale University, as well as her PhD and master's degree from the University of Chicago. Dr. Stearns' work focuses on the relationship between economic life and political ideology in early America, especially on the role of Western expansion in defining the American Republic. Her first book, which is available for you to purchase right out there in the atrium, so make sure you pick up a copy of Empire of Commerce, the closing of the Mississippi and the opening of Atlantic trade. It was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2024. Dr. Stearns has also recently published a chapter on frontier merchants and imperial authority in an edited volume with the University of Pennsylvania Press. A committed teacher with an MAT degree from the University of Louisville, Dr. Stearns has also taught the usual slate of courses on early America at the University of Mississippi, as well as seminars on course design, on online teaching, teaching with technology, and teaching writing through content. She's presently working on a new project, which is a history of frontier Memphis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stearns.
So thank you, Afton, and thank you, Darren, for those generous introductions, and thank you all for coming. My talk today is called When the South Was West, the Mississippi and the Founding of the Nation. It's changed a lot since I sent that title in, so it doesn't quite align with what you'll see today, but it'll work. Okay, gives you an idea of time periods and places. So, in 1956, the Walt Disney Corporation released a film entitled Davy Crockett and the River Pirates. A prequel to the 1955 movie Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, Davy Crockett and the River Pirates was part of a global pop culture phenomenon. By the end of the 1950s, Disney had sold more than 300 million copies worth of Davy Crockett products, and the coonskin cap and the pop gun had become staples of an American childhood. And when I say global, I really mean global. This is the Spanish language edition. This one's from Argentina. This one is from France. This one's from Japan, where it played really well. And this one's from Sweden, where, again, it was extremely popular. So I'm not going to talk today about why Davy Crockett and the River Pirates became a phenomenon. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with Cold War, but I'm an 18th century historian, so my knowledge of history starts to get really fuzzy after about the War of 1812. Even the historical Davy Crockett is well after my major time period. But it's worth starting today's talk with this movie for a few reasons. The first is that it's possible some members of the audience may have seen this movie. Anybody seen Davy Crockett and the River Pirates? A couple people, two people, there you go. Okay. The second has to do with the film's plot. The story begins with Davy Crockett, accomplished hunter and well-known fighter of indigenous people, arriving in Maysville, Kentucky, along the Ohio River with a cargo of furs he wants to ship to Natchez, near the mouth of the Mississippi. In hard-drinking, hard-fighting Maysville, he encounters the notorious riverboatman Mike Fink, who boasts he can outrun, outjump, outsing, outswim, outdance, outshoot, outdrink, outcuss, and outfight anybody on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers together. Fink offers to transport Crockett down the river to either Natchez or New Orleans for the princely sum of $1,000. Dismayed, Crockett and his companions start to look for another boat, only to be told that no one is traveling downriver, as some unspecified group of indigenous people have been attacking river travelers. However, with Davy Crockett's reputation as a frontier fighter as a lure, he puts together a crew who ultimately challenge Fink to a race down the Ohio to the Mississippi. Having bested Mike Fink on his journey to Natchez, Davy and his friend decide to return home by foot. Along the way, they encounter a group of Chickasaw. Caught between a long-standing friendship with the famous Davy Crockett and worried about potential retaliation against themselves at the hands of riverboat men who believe they've been attacking shipping, the Chickasaw seize Davy and his companion. A messenger from the Kaskaskias, an indigenous group residing near the Ohio River, has come to the Chickasaw, asking for aid against white men who have been killing his people. The Kaskaskia messenger bitterly denies Davy's claims that the Kaskaskia have been attacking shipping. Although Davy has earned a reputation fighting indigenous peoples, he believes the Kaskaskia man and realizes that the men raiding the river are white. He devises a plan to capture the pirates and reclaim the river for American trade. Davy, Fink, and the Chickasaw team up to defeat the pirates, and a fierce battle ensues. Armed with only a large stick, Davy and his companion Georgie follow the retreating villains into their cave, where evidence of months of their thievery are on display. The story ends with a reprise of the famous Davy Crockett song, which in 1955 was the number 6, number 22, and number 24 Billboard chart hit for that year. Beating out the Four Aces song Love is a Many Splendored Thing by one spot. You guys probably know that one. Okay. So this movie is definitely fictional and also super problematic for the way it handles many, many, many issues. But it's not quite pure fiction. Davy Crockett certainly existed, as did river pirates, as did Mike Fink, famed keelboat man. But what the movie begins to make clear, and what I want to talk about today, is about the dimensions of international trade in the 18th century. Davy and his buddy Georgie, Davy and his buddy Georgie are headed to Natchez to sell their fur, but Natchez is not the ultimate market. Presumably, the bear and buffalo Davy was exporting were on their way first to New Orleans and then on to Boston or Paris, where they would line the gloves of someone who would likely never set foot on the soil of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Certainly, too, the Chickasaw played an outsized role in the trade of the 18th century, a role that gave them diplomatic and economic clout that is surprising given their relatively small numbers. And certainly, interracial violence and misunderstanding provided a background against which all the rest unfolded. Davy Crockett and the River Pirates is part of a larger story of mid-20th century celebrations of Americana, still evident in places like Disney's Frontierland. But it also offers us an avenue for entering into the real world of Mississippi trade in the 18th and early 19th centuries. By the time Davy Crockett was born in 1786, the Mississippi River was functioning as a conduit, tying the interior of the continental United States to Atlantic world markets in fur, but also increasingly in agricultural produce. Later, cotton would join the stream. In my book, Empire of Commerce, The Closing of the Mississippi and the Opening of Atlantic Trade, I trace the role that the Mississippi played in the politics of the American founding and its critical role in the process of Western expansion. The story begins well before the 1780s, when European colonizers had first recognized the role that the Mississippi could play in allowing access to the continental interior. First the French, and then the Spanish and the British fought for supremacy over the river's trade, understanding that the Mississippi was a crucial link in securing the continent's heartland. Despite European powers' best efforts in the 18th century, the Chickasaw remained a dominant force controlling the trade of the central part of the river. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, a new entity entered the battle for access to the Mississippi, the United States. As American settlers attempted to claim Western lands, they entered the imperial conflict over who should have access to the Mississippi, and with it, access to the markets of the Atlantic world. What the Davy Crockett movie gets right about Mississippi trade, a shorthand for the trade that flowed down the Ohio and Tennessee rivers before ultimately entering the Mississippi and proceeding on to Natchez and New Orleans, was intentionally important in the 18th century. Even before the Declaration of Independence, settlers from what would become the new United States had begun pouring across the Appalachian Mountains. Eager to acquire land in the West, the new settlers went about the task of transforming the landscape into property. Mississippi River trade, which had previously been dominated by furs, deerskins, and French traders catering to indigenous peoples living between the Appalachians and Rocky Mountains, transformed. The Western American settlers wanted to use the river in a new way. to ship the produce of their farms first down the Ohio, then to the Mississippi, and then onwards into the Gulf of Mexico, where it could be sold to the staple-producing islands of the Caribbean or transported to Europe. In the 18th century, Western settlers wanted access to the river because they wanted access to land. And to acquire that land, they needed markets for the corn, whiskey, and pork they produced. In early America, successfully claiming land was indelibly tied to trade. To obtain legal title to land, settlers needed to be able to pay for it. To retain title, they needed to be able to pay their taxes. In 1784, angered by grandiose American claims to ownership of much of what is now Mississippi and Alabama, and alarmed over the rapid spread of Western settlement, Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. The closure of the Mississippi eliminated Westerners' access to markets and hence their ability to claim Western land, throwing their economy into disarray. The resulting crisis threatened to fracture the nascent United States along sectional lines. From 1786 until 1810, obtaining Western trade and then facilitating its development was a key component of American statecraft. But given this talk is largely about a river, I also want to talk about something a little surprising, a road. Once Davy and his friends had sold their cargo in New Orleans, they had to return home, and they did so along the Natchez Trace. Today, the Natchez Trace Parkway is a federal recreational road that stretches 444 miles from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville. Anyone know the Natchez Trace? Anybody done that one? That one's a little more popular. Okay, all right. It's bucolic scenery and low speed limit, 50 miles per hour, strictly enforced, and enforced by federal law, so don't get a ticket on the Natchez Trace. Really important lesson to learn. Make it a popular site for bicycling and for hikers. But in the 18th century, the pathway served a very different role. Between 1801 and 1811, the path known as the Natchez Trace was the most important road in the United States. In the 1790s, the trace, This is somewhat ironic, as at the time, the bulk of the road was not in the United States. In the 1790s, the trace connected the state of Tennessee with the U.S.'s newest territorial outpost, the village of Natchez, located along the American border with Spain, bisecting the territory of the Choctaw and Chickasaw peoples. Beginning in the 1790s, this obscure footpath became an avenue for state building for both the Chickasaw Nation and the United States. Decades before Americans would settle along its boundaries, the Natchez Trace became a key artery of American expansion, not by promoting settlement, but by enabling Mississippi River trade. By helping to make Western trade profitable, the Trace supported the value of investments made in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, by individuals and by the federal government. The Natchez Trace performed a key function in binding together the eastern and western United States. In the process, it facilitated the transformation of that territory into the American South. So the Natchez Trace is particularly important to talk about here. This room is, likely as you know, the Tupelo Room. The modern city of Tupelo, Mississippi, sits on the site of the core of the Chickasaw people's ancestral homeland. Here on campus, we are also on Chickasaw territory. Examining Mississippi River trade, as well as travel along the Natchez Trace, helps to illuminate the role of the Chickasaw in the early republic and in shaping this region. Ironically, given the stereotypes that this movie helped to perpetuate, Davy Crockett and the River Pirates offers an avenue for exploring a broad picture of Mississippi River trade. What happened on the river depended, in part, on what happened in Chickasaw country. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to situate ourselves in 1802. By that point, the dimensions of American trade along the Mississippi had become well established, although further conflict, which would ultimately result in the Louisiana Purchase, remained. I've already mentioned that in 1784, Spain had closed the Mississippi River to American trade, but by 1796, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, better known as Pinckney's Treaty, had gone into effect, settling 15 years of conflict between the United States and Spain over territory and trade. This is Pinckney's Treaty, and it shows the area that was disputed between the United States and Spain. It's an area that is stretches from the modern-day 31st parallel, which is the northern border of Florida, all the way up to Paducah, Kentucky. The treaty extended the United States paper boundaries, bringing its southern border to the 31st parallel and adding a region the size of New England to the national domain. The treaty also gave Americans access to the Spanish port of New Orleans. It was geology as much as politics which dictated the importance of the Mississippi and of access to New Orleans for Western settlers like Davy Crockett. In elementary school, I'm guessing, we all learned about the continental divide. Did you guys with me? You guys learned about the continental divide at some point in elementary school? Okay. We're told it's an invisible line somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, which separates the rivers that flow into the Atlantic from the ones that flow into the Pacific. I was in graduate school before I learned that there are actually 6 continental divides in North America. And it was this one, the one marked here in orange. This one, that elevated the importance of the Mississippi for those who occupy the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. This continental divide lies on the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians form a watershed that separates the rivers that flow into the Atlantic from those that flow into the Gulf of Mexico. This geological bifurcation had important ramifications for Western trade and settlement. In an era without mechanized travel or paved roads, water travel was the easiest way to pass long distances or transport heavy cargo. Even today, a single barge on the Mississippi replaces the labor and the carbon emissions of nearly 70 trucks. In the 18th century, water was the only way to transport heavy cargo, and it was generally the swiftest way for travel from one place to another. In the 18th century, for much of the year, the Ohio River offered boats relatively easy passage. The Ohio begins near Pittsburgh, and from there, ships descending the river faced only 2 primary obstacles. The first was geological, and the second was human-made. When water levels were low or moderate, flatboats bound southward were forced to portage around the falls of the Ohio, a series of rapids near what's now Louisville, Kentucky, which led to the creation of that city. And also prior to 1796, travelers on the river faced near constant threat of violence as white settlers engaged in a decade-long war with the allied indigenous nations north of the Ohio River. But if you survived that part, you continued on down the Ohio. The Ohio flows into the Mississippi near the modern-day city of Cairo, Illinois, 981 miles from its origin near Pittsburgh. Before the levees hemmed in the Mississippi, the river sprawled several miles wide across its floodplain. Andrew Ellicott, a surveyor famous in his own age for laying out the streets of Washington, D.C., and surveying the Mason-Dixon line, even though he gets no credit for that. It's not called the Mason-Dixon-Ellicott line. Recorded that although both the Mississippi and the Ohio drained a vast extent of mountainous and hilly country, they joined their waters in a swamp, stretching from 30 to 45 miles wide. Between what's now Cairo and New Orleans, there were only 11 locations along the river that almost never flooded. Flat, unvariegated land, like what you see if you drive west from Batesville or along the Arkansas side of I-55, stretched as far as the eye could see. If the water is low, warned Ellicott, you have high banks, quicksands, and sandbars. And if the water is high, you might as well be at sea. For days together, you will float without meeting any land to set your feet on. But the land that the river passed through was by no means an unoccupied wilderness. It is not surprising, then, that the Chickasaw played a significant role in the Davy Crockett movie. In 1755, British Superintendent Edward Atkin had informed his superiors that it is not possible to cast an eye ever so lightly over the map without being struck by the importance of the Chickasaw homeland. So the Chickasaw homeland these are 2 18th century maps that Atkins would have looked at, and the Chickasaw are firmly displayed in both. You can see them, Chickasaw here, and also here, Chickasaw homelands are clearly displayed here. This is somewhat surprising on these maps. In the 1750s, when these maps were being made, there were only about 2,000 Chickasaw people total. So the fact that people in London and people in Paris are debating the Chickasaw and thinking about the Chickasaw tells us a lot about their role in the region and their importance, geopolitically, essentially. The Chickasaw homeland, Atkins asserted, is the most important place in North America for the British to control. The Chickasaw homeland lies in a central place about the middle of the Mississippi and commands all the water passages between New Orleans and Canada, and from the Mississippi eastward to the British colonies. Most importantly, the Chickasaw homeland included what the Chickasaw called Sakilatha, the scored bluffs that line the eastern shore of the Mississippi at the present-day site of Memphis, Tennessee. This is the best shot I could get of them. It's really hard to find pictures of the Chickasaw Bluffs these days, and I have no access to a boat to go out to the Mississippi to take a picture, but best I could do. Okay, called the Chickasaw Bluffs by the English, the bluffs occupy one of the few highlands along the river and the first substantial overlook south of the Mississippi's confluence with the Ohio. The bluffs had enormous significance to the Chickasaw, who viewed them, as one Chickasaw leader claimed in negotiations with the Spanish, as the most precious parts of their land. A place of tremendous strategic and spiritual importance. For the Chickasaw, they demarcated the area of the river that was under Chickasaw control. At the bluffs, the complementary features of land and water collided. The bluffs rising high above the water offered a vantage point from which the Chickasaw could see movements along the river, and islands in the river's channel caused the waters of the Mississippi to eddy and swirl. The resulting current forced boats to hug the shore, causing them to come within a pistol shot of the bluffs, where they became easy prey for land-based raiding parties. Control over the bluffs allowed the Chickasaw to control traffic along the river, giving the Chickasaw a powerful tool in their diplomacy with other regional powers. The Chickasaw were unquestionably at the heart of Mississippi River trade, a reality that everyone engaged in the trade along the river, indigenous, European, or Euro-American, was forced to recognize and consider as they navigated its currents. As the Chickasaw's diplomatic relationships with the Spanish and the Americans changed, the Chickasaw's role in the river trade changed. It would not be until 1818 that the Chickasaw would fully cede control over the bluffs that bear their name. And it's really important to think here that the Chickasaw controlled this region. In 1784, I already mentioned that Spain closed the Mississippi to American trade. What's kind of ironic about that is that the Chickasaw had closed the river to Spanish trade for the previous 4 years. Not a single Spanish ship had been allowed to travel up the Mississippi past the site of what's now Memphis in the previous 4 years. But Spain's still like, nope, we control the river, it's ours. Telling you a lot about how imperial powers operate. Part of why the Chickasaw were able to use control over the highlands to regulate the river's trade has to do with the interaction between the river's geology and the 18th century technology. Let's go back to Maysville, Kentucky for a second, where the fictional Davy Crockett hoped to find a boat headed towards Natchez. There are many kinds of boats that plied the river. There were pirogues, canoes, and European warboats that occasionally patrolled its waters. But the two types of boats that were the most important to Mississippi River trade were the flatboat and the keelboat. Had Davy been an actual hunter in the 18th century Kentucky, he wouldn't have taken a second look at Mike Finn's boat, the Gully Whumper, a frankly tiny and inadequate keelboat. This portrayal of keelboats really bothers me a lot, and I understand that I'm the only person, like in North America, for whom this would be a problem, but it's the fictional keelboat in that movie is not okay. These are better depictions of actual what a flatboat and a keelboat might look like. Okay. In the era before steamboats, and for decades after their debut, it was flatboats that dominated the southward-bound river trade. It's not clear that Davy Crockett ever did travel down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and if he had, we probably would know because he liked to talk quite a lot, which is why they made movies about him 100 years later. But if he had gone down the river to New Orleans, he would have taken a flatboat. That's what Abraham Lincoln took when he went down to New Orleans in the 1830s, when he spent a summer laboring on a boat belonging to a local merchant, relaying Illinois flour and salt pork to markets. Easily constructed, flatboats were essentially rafts that were about 60 feet long, 15 feet wide, and surrounded by walls that were 4 to 5 feet high. In the words of one 18th century traveler, great square boxes that weren't so much sailed or rowed as they were abandoned to the mercy of the stream. It took roughly 4 or 5 men to maneuver these heavily laden ships from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, and typically took 6 to 7 weeks for a ship to make the journey. When the boat arrived at its destination, be that Cincinnati, Louisville, Natchez, or New Orleans, it was typically broken apart and sold, usually repurposed into the walls or roof of a hastily constructed shelter. Flatboats were built to take advantage of the river's currents. Barring inevitable problems with spring floods and summer droughts, Travelers headed south and west towards the new settlements in Trans-Appalachia or headed on to New Orleans and Natchez found geology worked in their favor. The current of the rivers propelled goods and people inexorably toward the Mississippi and the Gulf, where the port of New Orleans offered a potent lure as both a market for Western goods and a transportation hub from which Western produce could be shipped throughout the throughout the Caribbean or across the Atlantic littoral. I've been talking about a lot of different places. Maysville, Kentucky is roughly right around here. We've got Memphis here, the Chickasaw Bluffs, New Orleans, all the way down here. Natchez is right here. And so I wanted to quickly bring up the map in case your knowledge of Mississippi River geography is not quite as extensive as mine after like 13 years of working on this project. But it is important to really understand this point. So you take a flatboat if you want to go south down the river. But if you want to go north, back up the river, you're going to have to make a different choice. Getting back upriver was incredibly difficult. Upriver travel was conducted via the keelboat, this one. This is the type of boat that both the historical and the fictional Mike Fink operated. Built long and skinny to slice through the water, keelboats were more maneuverable than flatboats, but they faced a much more challenging journey. Traveling upriver meant fighting the current. When they could, keelboat crews rowed. Sometimes, when the banks were clear, the crews walked along the shoreline, towing the boat northwards. Other times, keelboats sent a few men ahead to tie a rope around a large tree, and then they slowly winched the rope back up until they were parallel with the tree before they tied their rope to another tree. Most of the time, though, keelboats were propelled against the current by means of poling. Each man stood near the gunwales of the ship, that's the sort of the front of the ship, with a long wooden pole held to his side. When the pilot gave the signal, they sank their poles into the mud at the bottom of the river, braced against their shoulders, and walked towards the stern, slowly inching the boat northward, but essentially walking the distance they were traveling many times over. One 60-foot keelboat length at a time. Poling a boat would move it forwards at the rate of about 2 miles per hour. So when we're talking about, say, 981 miles from Cairo, Illinois to Pittsburgh, you undertake that method of travel at your risk. Like that's not great for you, all in all. It explains a lot about why keelboat men were drinking quite a lot, all in all. Moving the boat northwards took a crew of 20 men and about several months of travel. It took one well-equipped crew 4 months to ascend from New Orleans to just north of what's now Memphis. Because of the difficulty of transporting goods against the current, keelboats were mostly used by fur traders who carried large supplies of valuable yet light manufactured goods northwards for trading with the indigenous peoples along the Mississippi, the Missouri, or one of its smaller offshoots. Keelboat crews were often comprised of men from a mix of cultural backgrounds, and the overwhelming majority of them were white. By the 1790s, a growing lower Mississippi cotton economy made enslaved laborers too valuable to do the far less remunerative and far more dangerous work undertaken on keelboats. These concrete realities and 18th century technologies shaped river trade. Moving from east to west was easy, going from north to south was easy, but going northeast necessitated constant, arduous labor. The reality of the river's current shaped its trade. So had Davy Crockett truly visited Maysville any time after about 1790, he would not have brought with him a load of fur. By this time, Spain agreed to allow Americans to trade through the port of New Orleans in 1795. The river was alive with flatboats, loaded not with fur, but with the produce of Ohio Valley farms. In Cashport, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, merchants traded manufactured goods for farm produce. Wheat flour was in high demand in the Caribbean, where a series of El Nino events had rendered the food supply of the Spanish and British West Indies even more precarious than usual. Wheat was also in high demand in Europe, where nearly a decade of war between revolutionary and later Napoleonic France had proven Tom Paine's pre-war prediction that the United States would always have a market for its goods as long as eating was the fashion in Europe had proven true. Kentucky had also grown into a large producer of hemp and a manufacturer of rope. which supplied the port of New Orleans, but also repaired sails in Jamaica and Havana. Hemp canvas, made by enslaved people in Kentucky, was also shipped to the region around Natchez, where cotton production had exploded in the 1790s. The canvas was used to bind the cotton into bales of roughly 375 pounds to keep it safe as it was shipped to New Orleans and to ports beyond. Finally, the Ohio Valley exported corn products. Probably still does, actually. Cornmeal, which has a higher moisture content than wheat flour, was not very much in demand. So Ohio farmers tended to transform their often abundant corn crops into commodities that were more saleable. The first such product was pork. The Ohio country exported enormous quantities of salt pork and huge numbers of live hogs. And if you think about putting a bunch of live hogs on a flatboat and then setting them out to sea on the Mississippi, how bad that would smell, and it would be awful. Like, from every component of that experience would be truly terrible. But so that was one of the ways that they used up their corn. They feed it to the pigs, and then the pigs carry the corn to market, if you think about it. But the other way that they transported corn was by transforming it into whiskey, and which found a ready market both along the Mississippi and in the port of New Orleans. And if anybody's ever been to New Orleans, even today, when you drink the water in New Orleans, it doesn't taste very good. It's also not particularly good for you in the 18th century when large cargoes of hogs keep arriving in your city. As a result, drinking whiskey is actually probably a safer path than drinking the city's water at that time. Certainly, you would consume a lot less mud if you drank the whiskey. But what this means is that by 1800, well over $1 million worth of Western goods arrived annually in New Orleans. The opening of the trade created a unique problem, one that Davy himself faced in the movie. Thousands of men who flooded downriver every spring needed a way to return home once they sold their produce. While many of these Western boat hands decided to stay in Louisiana, the majority of these men, like Davy, planned to return home overland. They did so carrying the money they had earned from the sale of their produce with them. So with cash loaded onto horses, rolled into packs, or sewn up into shirts, returning boatmen became the final link in a chain of interactions, allowing Ohio Valley settlers to profit from Western lands. And so if you think about this, they're selling several years' worth of produce every time they come down the river. So we're talking 4 or 5 years' worth of all the money they'll earn is being traded at New Orleans. And then because it's the 18th century, money is like gold and silver. So you're literally, you've got pack horses full of money that have to get back to Kentucky and Tennessee. So this created a problem. And the problem actually had another dimension as well. When Pinckney's Treaty was passed, it extended the United States boundaries southwards to include the community of Natchez. By 1798, cotton production began to provide Natchez planters with opulent returns. Although Natchez was part of the United States on paper, in reality, connections between the United States and its new acquisition were tenuous. In 1799, it took at least 2 months, often 3, for mail to reach Philadelphia from Natchez. Business mail might travel through New Orleans and then on to eastern cities with relative ease, but government correspondence was trickier. As masters of New Orleans, Spanish officials could intercept any mail traveling through the city, making the construction of a road between Tennessee and Natchez a matter of national security. American officials were also concerned about Natchez's precarious geopolitical position, with the Spanish to the south vulnerable to attacks from Britain descending the Mississippi from Canada and surrounded by powerful indigenous nations. American control over Natchez was at best loose. A road connecting Natchez to their closest American neighbors in Tennessee would buttress the region's security while allowing both information and people to flow between the lower Mississippi Valley and U.S. settlements in the north. Because the route would pass through both federal territory and the lands of the Choctaw and Chickasaw, the responsibility for securing such a road fell to the federal government. So the route that they settled on was known by many names. The Chickasaw Trace, the path to the Choctaw, the Natchez Road, the road to Nashville if you were going north, or the road to Natchez if you're going south. In the 1790s, the Trace was not really a road, but it was more a series of paths that radiated outwards from the Chickasaw homeland and passed along the watershed of the Tombigbee River, in case you're wondering exactly where this is located. Stretching more than 500 miles north and east of Natchez, the route had been instrumental to both warfare and trade for centuries. But despite its long history, travelers often lost their way on the road, and prior to 1801, there were no inns or taverns along the way to accommodate travelers, and few places to acquire more supplies. So imagine you're a Kentucky farm boy, you just arrived in New Orleans, you're on your way back, and you've arrived in Natchez, there's thousands of you, and you need to get home, and there's no actual road to get you there. But the way is going to take you through people who don't really want you in their territory, and it's setting up a lot of problems for people. Reports of frequent illness and injury along the trace, along with far less theft than it would eventually obtain a reputation for, and that Davy Crockett and the River Pirates helps sort of perpetuate the myth of, drove the federal government to intercede to secure the path. Likewise, the government was aware of the dangers posed by thousands of whites trudging through indigenous homelands. The potential for interracial violence was never far from the surface. Securing the road became a key component of the U.S. government's diplomacy with southeastern tribes. In fall of 1801, American commissioners met with leaders from the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. The Cherokee, who faced the greatest pressure from white settlement, refused to allow a road through their territory, so the commissioners responded by shifting the end of the road from Knoxville, which was the original plan, to Nashville. Facing a subsistence crisis caused by drought and the decline of their traditional game, the Choctaw agreed to cede more than 2.5 million acres in the southwest corner of their territory and gave the United States permission to construct a wagonway through their homeland in exchange for a payment of $2,000. For their part, the Chickasaw surprised the commissioners with how quickly they agreed for a road to be constructed through their lands. The Chickasaw recognized that denying access to the road would engender conflict with the federal government and with thousands of boatmen who journeyed through their territory each year. Knowing this, the Chickasaw bartered the boatmen's safe passage to their territory to protect themselves from Euro-American encroachment on their lands. The Chickasaw would permit the construction of a road and the passage of Americans along it, but not American control of the road. They forbade any of the whites to settle on the road or have any profit arising therefrom. Instead, the Chickasaw would see to the needs of the travelers along the trace. It did not take long before the Chickasaw developed a service economy, catering to the needs of the men and animals moving along the trace. Federal intervention in acquiring and building the trace helped to reshape the relationship between the West and the rest of the Union. In 1786, tumultuous debates over the terms of the Spanish-American Treaty over the status of the Mississippi had divided the states, with southern states aligning themselves with western settlers and insisting on an American right to trade along its waters, and eastern states willing to cede American claims to the river in exchange for access to Spanish markets. The negotiations ratcheted up tensions between the East and the West as a significant component of the Western political elite began to contemplate the possibility of secession. While that did not occur, the debate left a legacy of Western animosity towards these East Coast politicians who had been willing to cede their claims to the Mississippi. The most lasting consequence of this was that, almost from the moment of their admittance to the Union, the Western states had become virulently anti-federalist, both in their opposition to the ratification of the Constitution, but also as the nation's first political parties took shape against the policies and practices of the Federalist Party. John Jay, who had led negotiations with Spain, was universally hated in the West, and in 1794 was burned in effigy by the citizens of Lexington, Kentucky, and hung about his neck was a copy of John Adams's book, The Defense of the Constitutions of the Government of the United States. Both Kentucky and Tennessee voted with the Democratic Republican Party. By 1800, they had helped Jefferson and his followers obtain dominance in the House, Senate, and Electoral College. Nevertheless, the threat of Western secession remained a possibility, as Western interests differed from those of Easterners. Opposition to the tax on whiskey, foreign intrigue, and the passage of the Kentucky Resolutions in 1798 brought the possibility of Western secession to the fore. So the Natchez Trace was widely viewed as an avenue by which the federal government could cement the loyalty of Westerners to the Union. In 1801, federal troops began clearing the road. The Kentucky Gazette reported that building the road was a sign of the friendly disposition of the executive towards the Union's western regions. In Nashville, the Tennessee Gazette hailed the road as demonstrating Jefferson's marked attachment to the interests of the most remote parts of the United States. Nothing could tend more to the welfare of the Western country than the construction of a road from Nashville to the Natchez, and the great advantages which we may expect from the American Union begin now to be manifested. As an act of domestic policy, improving the trace helped cement Western loyalty to the nation, but also helped entrench Westerners as devotees of the Democratic Republican Party. The Natchez Trace and Mississippi River trade transformed the political economies of the communities that it connected. and the lower Mississippi Valley, the Chickasaw homeland, Middle Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Ohio Valley settlements beyond. Americans had spent decades clamoring for Mississippi River trade, yet they failed to realize the importance of this final link in the circuit tying Trans-Appalachia to the Atlantic world. From 1798 until the widespread adoption of the steamboat in the 1810s, the Natchez Trace played a central role in generating cash for Trans-Appalachia, cash that could be used to settle Western debts with the East Coast, to pay taxes, and to finance further land purchases. Even the federal government was just beginning to assert itself along the trace. The Tennessee Gazette, published in Nashville, reported that from the best calculations we were able to make, that not less than $120,000 crossed the Cumberland River at this place from Natchez in New Orleans, destined for Kentucky and the back parts of Pennsylvania, and horse loads daily passing. The trace played an important part in justifying, after the fact, the decisions of thousands of families to gamble their futures in moving westward. And David Crockett was one of those people. Okay, so that's my presentation. You guys have questions? Sorry. Yeah.
So I remember you were talking about how they would break up and sell the flatboats at the end of their journey and things. Was part of that consideration due to like sanitary concerns, given livestock were on there, or was that not even really on their concern list?
I don't think sanitation was really a huge part of thinking in this time period. There's a lot of, I don't think I'd want to live in a house that had partially spent like months on the Mississippi River. That would not smell good, all just by itself without like adding any hogs to the equation. So no, I don't think sanitation played a role, but it's definitely wood of all kinds, if you've been to New Orleans, is actually fairly scarce in the lower Mississippi Valley. Like you can find wood to burn, but you can't really find like planks. It's much harder to find those, so that's part of why they made that choice. Yeah.
Did tobacco play a significant role?
So not hugely. Tobacco was, like it's definitely grown in Kentucky, and even today, Kentucky is well known for growing a lot of tobacco. But Kentucky, it was hard to justify transporting tobacco that far, essentially, because competing markets, like in Virginia, for instance, produced equally good quality tobacco that would be sort of more easily accessed. But they definitely grew tobacco as part of it. But because you can't eat tobacco, it wasn't as big a part of it. Cotton, down the road, would become a huge, huge component of this trade, and really actually drive federal interest in the West and the eventual like creation of the Louisiana Purchase. But tobacco is not central. Yeah.
Could you talk for a second about Andrew Jackson vowing himself a Spaniard?
Okay, so thanks so much. 1789, Andrew Jackson, who was at the time 22, and also the Attorney General of what is now Tennessee. So what have you been up to lately, folks? I feel like we might be underachieving. He arrived in the town of Natchez along the Mississippi River, and he swore his allegiance to the crown of Spain. Now, the big thing to understand when we talk about Andrew Jackson in 1789 is really, at the time, there was no real sense of what it was to be an American. The American Constitution had been enacted only 2 months earlier when Jackson made this, swore this oath. But he'd spent a long time as like a North Carolinian, but after the American Revolution, it's not really clear what it will mean to be an American. So he arrives in Natchez, and if you are American, you cannot use the Mississippi River. But if you swear your allegiance to Spain, then you suddenly have access to the river. So he swears his allegiance to Spain and starts buying property in the area near Natchez and using the river for trade. He will eventually, too, use the city of Natchez as a refuge for his wife. So Andrew Jackson famously married a woman who had previously been married to somebody else. And he thought like they fell in love, and it's actually a little sweet. It's like the only story about Jackson I like. But he falls in love with this woman. And they think that her husband has divorced her in Kentucky. And so when they hear that he's like started a divorce with his wife, with this woman in Kentucky, they marry in Tennessee. But then her first husband shows up and starts suing them for bigamy. And so Andrew Jackson flees with his wife to Natchez, which at the time is Spanish territory. And because he's sworn his allegiance to the Spanish crown, he can leave his wife in Natchez. Moreover, because Spain is Catholic, they're willing to not recognize her previous Protestant marriage, essentially. And they're kind of okay with them continuing to sort of cohabitate in Natchez until that actually, they do get the divorce to go through eventually. Yeah.
So I have a question about the role or not of maybe buying and selling of any sort of products from the Native American peoples of Mississippi and their transport. So I don't know, can you talk, does your book address that?
So it doesn't spend much time on that. By the 1801, both the Choctaw and the Chickasaw have transformed their economies pretty dramatically from what we would sort of imagine. Both of them have turned substantially to ranching by that point in time, and they're selling a lot of meat to New Orleans. So they're still certainly hunting, but by this point, the deer supply in like what's now Mississippi had declined pretty dramatically. So in order for the Choctaw and the Chickasaw to continue to hunt as a major part of their economy, they had to go across the Mississippi River and use the lands that belonged to some of their allies, essentially, which brought them into conflict with a bunch of people, including the Osage, most notably. And if they upset the Osage are a major political power in this region, probably more effective than any other political power in this region. So they have to sort of tread lightly there. But the fur trade is continuing, and it's the main way that the federal government is willing to trade with the Chickasaw. So even if like a Chickasaw person comes to a trading post with actual cash, the federal government who's running the trading post would prefer that they used fur to trade. But the Chickasaw are doing a lot of sort of growing stuff that they're selling to Americans along the Trace. And as we get closer to the end of this time period, like by 1810, the Chickasaw, actually wealthy Chickasaw people, are growing a lot of cotton for export into global markets. So, yeah.
So you're talking about how this is just like a vital like transport network, Natchez Trace, and how these indigenous peoples were service economy and all that. Was that taken into any consideration when they're doing Indian removal? Like, we're going to undermine this key infrastructure that's set up?
By the time we get to the 1830s and Indian removal, it's much less of an issue. And in part, that's an issue because by the time we get to the 1830s, steamboats have also made the Natchez Trace like it's still useful, but it's nowhere near as important as it used to be. Because steamships make it possible for you to go back against the current of the Mississippi and sort of transform this trade in a lot of ways. One thing it does do, though, is that because the Chickasaw had access to cash via the Natchez Trace, like they kind of, if you think about it, like sort of siphoned off some of that cash that was going back to Kentucky and Tennessee. Because they had cash, they actually were in a better position relative to other indigenous peoples. Part of the way that sort of plays out, and also the Chickasaw are basically the only indigenous nation, or the only large indigenous nation in the eastern half of the United States that have never gone to war with the United States. They were always, if not allies, then neutral towards the United States. And as a result, they had a lot of it's not goodwill, that would be really overstating the situation. But they had a little bit more authority in making some of the negotiations. And so the Chickasaw actually controlled the process of selling their land and of buying the supplies for their trip to Indian Territory, which made a huge difference in the results, versus the Cherokee, who were clearly undersupplied, and also because they'd resisted so strongly removing, ended up having a lot of people having to leave without having planned to leave. They end up with a very different situation. But even today, if you go down to the Chancery Building in Oxford, you can see the signatures of the Chickasaw people who sold their land to arriving whites right before removal. And so you can go take a look at those if you want to. Well, then I'll just show you guys this one last slide. This is this is part of the Natchez Trace, and part of what you can probably see from this is how many people's feet walked along it. It's literally been carved into the land. That's sort of one of the few places along the existing pathway where you can see the original trace. So that's pretty much it for me. So thanks.